My dear brothers and sisters in the risen Lord, third week of Lent, Saturday. True humility makes way for Christ and throws the soul at his feet, said by John Mason. The Talmud, the book of Jewish civil and ceremonial laws and legends from 5th century AD, narrates the story of Rabbi Simon ben Jokai. His claim is atrocious, abhorrent, and arrogant. The Talmud stated that his worthiness was so great that during his whole lifetime no rainbow was needed to ensure immunity from a flood, and whose power was such that he could say to a valley, "Be filled with gold dinars." The same rabbi used to say that if there were only two righteous men in the world, he and his son were these, and if only one, it was he. He even had the audacity to say that if Abraham had redeemed all generation to that of Rabbi Simon himself, the later claimed to redeem by his own merits all that followed to the end of the world. Nay, that if Abraham was reluctant, he, Simon, would take his own son with him and reconcile with the whole world. In today's gospel, we heard about the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. This parable was designed to convict those who believe in their own righteousness and despise others. Let us note 1. The Andes of the Pharisee. The Pharisee went to the temple not to pray and plead for God's mercy, but to inform him about his own righteousness. His attitude and his words smack of reigning pride, deep-seated malice, and loathsome arrogance, for which he was rightly condemned by Christ. The Pharisee wrongly esteemed himself of being justified before God. All that of God wished from him, he believed that he had fulfilled. A great deal of good things he said about himself. It is true that he was free from any scandalous sins. He was not a thief, not a cheat, not an extortionist building and profiting from people, not an adulterer pandering to his lust. He was fair in his dealing with others. He observed scrupulously all the laws, and sometimes he even went beyond the requirement of the law. He fasted twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and thus glorified God in his body, and he tethered all his income and thus glorified God from his material income. There was a great amount of goodness on the part of the Pharisee. We should be miserable if we fail to imitate his virtues and have his righteousness. But for all his righteousness, the Pharisee somehow fell miserably short of justifying righteousness. What then were the great sins of the Pharisee which condemned him? The Pharisee mistook the external ceremonies for real spirituality. He wrongly believed that his observance of the law without the corresponding purification of the heart would justify him. He foolishly depended upon his merits and righteousness. His merits, he thought, had justified him. He foolishly believed that by his righteousness he had made God his debtor. We must always remember that when we stand before God, we always we always stand as sinners, and to get remittance for our sins, we must not depend upon our righteousness, but on the mercy of God. Another great sin of the Pharisee was his pride. His righteousness, instead of making him humble and loving, had filled him with the reigning pride and insolence for others. He despised others. Like the publican who did not lead lives like himself. The Pharisee went to the temple to pray, but forgot his purpose because of his obsession with himself. He was so much satisfied with himself that he never felt that he had any need which he could present before God. He asked nothing from God, and he went home receiving nothing from him. The prayer of the publican. The posture and the prayer of the publican are full of humility and humiliation. He stood far off, not daring to come into God's presence, and he lifted not his eyes, feeling unworthy to confront God. He beat his breast, a penitent's due, and uttered a small prayer. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The whole attitude of the prayer of the publican were that of a sincere penitent who relied for the remission of his sins upon God's mercy. The publican felt a great need for God's forgiveness and said a short prayer, not daring to speak much before God, and God registered his prayer and answered him. He went home justified. May God bless you all.